Good evening and welcome everybody to Carolina's first permanent European settlement with Tom Magnuson and the Orange County Historical Museum. My name is Tanya Day and I am the site manager here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that tonight is being recorded. This recording will be made available to you within the next 2 days or so. But keeping that in mind, please make sure that your microphone and your videos do stay off throughout the presentation. So please do stay muted. I'm sure you are absolutely lovely looking, but no cameras tonight, please. We will absolutely have time at the end to take questions. You can just pop them into the chat box and I will read them out to Tom at the end. So let's begin. We will have an introduction from Tom Magnuson from our fabulous board member, Tanya Brahmi.
Hi, everybody. My name's Tanya Brahmi. I know it's confusing, but anyway, I'm on the board for the museum. I'm thrilled tonight to introduce our fellow board member and famous historian and man about town, Tom Magnuson. Most of you who are on here probably know Tom and know that he's the founder and CEO of the Trading Path Association, a fabulous organization that's taken a deep look over decades now into how this area was settled by people that didn't originate here. And they've focused on discovering, unearthing, and exploring the trading paths that were used by those early settlers. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that tonight. That's why we're here. I urge you all to join me in welcoming Tom Magnuson. Tom?
First I unmute and then I throw some color on. And then I tried to find my presentation. Ah, here we go. Is that working?
Not quite yet, Tom. We can still see you, but we can't see your presentation just yet.
Let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. Probably not. There we go.
The magic is happening now.
Is that okay?
That's it.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's really nice when the computer cooperates. This is the second in the series of talks. It'll be three talks and a fourth summarizing the three. But the first talk, I addressed the commercial aspects of the indigenous people in Carolina and how they probably had a significant commercial relationship with pirates, privateers, and explorers in the Sounds, because the Sounds are much closer to the Spanish Main than any other safe harbors. The evidence for this was left out last time, so I want to touch on it tonight. The thing that got me interested in looking at the Sounds was Mosely's 1733 map, and it shows in an inset map. It shows the island of Ocracoke, and it's right adjacent to Teach's Hole is a well. I have never seen a well represented on a North Carolina map of any kind except this one, which indicates it was rather important. You can see it right here. And there's Teach's Hole. Now, for those of you not into your pirate things, Teach's or Thatch's hole is actually Teach's hole. That's Teach is Blackbeard. So we have this close connection between a well-known pirate and this well. I find the well important for two reasons. One, it was important enough to put on this map, probably drawn in, before 1711. And because the technology needed to sink a well in sand was not available to the Native Americans. The indigenous people didn't know how to plank wood. They didn't have the tools for it and so forth. And the way you build a well in sand is you make a box, and then some expendable person climbs inside the box and digs out the sand, and then guys outside with big mauls drive that box down, and you put another box on top of it and another on top of that until you've got a well. And that's what we have here. It apparently was bricked up in the 19th century. So it was probably an asset for the Navy, U.S. Navy, and the forts on the Sounds where water was precious. All right, having noted that, and I apologize for leaving it out before, it's all part of this map. This is the Mosely Map of 1733. And the important parts of it are up here in the northeast corner. This is the Albemarle region, and it's lousy with roads. We'll be looking at this in closer detail later on, but take my word for it, there are a lot of roads in this Albemarle region in a 1733 map. And that's because it got settled in the 1650s. There are two other roads on the map. One of them goes down along the coast and connects the Albemarle with Charleston, which they were still part of just Carolina. There was not a North Carolina or a South Carolina at first. And so the importance of this map cannot be overstated. It shows this road cutting across the Piedmont. And at some point in my studies, I realized it wasn't a trading path. It was labeled as a road. It's a wagon road. And in my research, I found out that it was a military road built in 1702, between 1702 and 1704. Here are the books and the map that infused this particular talk the most. Hugo Lemming's Hidden Americans is fundamental, and it's important because Hugo Prosper Lemming, bless his heart and his great name, was he was an offspring of the Albemarle people, and he was also a minister, and he did his PhD late in life, a little bit too late, because when it was in manuscript form yet he died, and his parishioners just off the University of Chicago campus had it published, and it never was properly edited. So there's a 1969 edition you don't want to look at. It's pretty awful, but the footnotes are utterly invaluable. And fortunately for us all, in 1995, Rutgers Press hired an editor and gave it a proper editing, and it's a highly readable book at this point, but look for the 1995 edition. Nerlene Melangeans has written the same history from political documents, and whereas Hugo Prosper Lemming included the narratives that he heard in his youth, the oral history of the Albemarle peoples, and they were triracial for the most part, and therefore left out of the written histories. McIlvaney's gives us a decent history of the Anglican record of conquest in the Albemarle, how they subdued the Quakers and the pirates and all the other fellows. And this by Mark Hanna's got a recent book, Nests of Pirates, which is a interesting treatise on the value of pirates in the anarchic regions of an empire, out on the periphery of the empire. The pirates provide an economy and a security that the government at home can't do. And he found by looking at records that every single colony on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast, cooperated and embraced pirates as valuable citizens. In North Carolina, the governor attended Blackbeard's 14th wedding, and I believe the lieutenant governor was himself a privateer, quote unquote. So that's a very valuable book because it demonstrates the close affinity for the early colonies and their pirates. Edward Mosely, A Correct Map of the Province of North Carolina in 1733, is used a tremendous amount of work that was produced by himself and John Lawson between 1701 and 1711. Lawson mapped the sounds very accurately while he was Surveyor General. So we'll touch on that later on. This settlement came into being because of the English Civil War, which the parliamentary army, called the Roundheads, were all dissenters, Protestants, and the Royal Army were all Loyalists and Royalists and Anglicans, because Henry VIII had created a English version of the Catholic Church in which the king served as the Pope. And Cromwell's army is really beat the heck out of the Royal Army. It was not a questionable victory. And at the end of the war in 1651, as usual with wars, you got all these young, sturdy folk hitting the job market at the same time. And so they were looking for an outlet, somewhere where they might be able to find a job or a career or perhaps some land. And some of them had amassed enough money to own ships and have the ability to move these people to the States, to the colonies in North America. And they did so. They thought, reasonably enough, that they would enjoy the same freedom and respect in America as they did in England. Recognize they were the victors. They whooped those boys, and as a result, they were left alone. There was no more harassment of dissenters in England at the end of this Civil War, and they were wrong. And they learned that very quickly when they got to North America. Backing up a tad, just to suggest how it is they got to the Albemarle, John Smith made a map in 1608, and he mapped the entire Chesapeake Bay, pretty remarkable effort, and went down the Nansemond River, which is southwest corner of Chesapeake Bay, to Suffolk, where currently Suffolk exists. Suffolk is the blue water port off the Chesapeake. That is the southernmost port that a blue water seafaring ship could deliver cargo. He went down the Nansemond as far as the Suffolk area and found that there were great cornfields. Anyway, showing the mentality of a typical Anglican, he ordered his troops to open fire on natives, and then demanded that they provide corn to the English settlers who couldn't figure out how to stay alive themselves. You can get cargo from some Suffolk down into the Albemarle two ways. As the head of Blue Water Navigation, it's just a one-day trip overland from there to the Chowan River, which dumps into the Albemarle Sound. And that's a great way to move things. And we have plenty of evidence that there were cargo handling vessels available in those early days. And the Suffolk Escarpment runs, it's an old sand dune. It was a beach at some point, and it's a raised sand dune west of the swamp, of the Dismal Swamp. And you can have a fairly dry route all the way from Suffolk to Edenton. The Virginia settlers settled the Nansemond River starting in 1624. So by 1650s, it was probably fairly densely populated, so travelers could depend on being able to buy supplies along the way if they needed to. Here are contrasting maps. On the left is the 1733 Mosely Map, showing 4 or 5 routes from Virginia down into the Albemarle, and they almost all depend at some point on the Suffolk Escarpment. And here's a modern, on the right side is a modern topo map showing that the roads haven't moved very much. There are very few options for how to get from Suffolk, Virginia to Edenton, very few, because of the swamp. And I've made a blue line on the Chowan River to show that it's probably the best way to move farm equipment.
We've lost the audio. I'm certain I'm not the only person.
No, and we've lost it here at the museum too. So let's see, I will try and contact Tom really quickly and see what's happening. Oh, Tom, you're back. Tom, we lost you. You froze for a moment, but now you're working well. So I suppose you'll be able to reshare your screen now. Fantastic.
Okay.
Here we are. Nice to work.
They wanted to use the Dismal Swamp as a moat because the Virginia governor and the Maryland governor hated them. The Virginia governor, who was a royalist and grinding his molars and sitting on the sidelines during the Civil War, once he got back in power, began arresting and punishing dissenters who he saw as traitors, where the Lord Baltimore, the governor of Catholic Maryland, saw all dissenters as heretics and threatened them with burning, branding, and jail, ear piercing, and stuff like that. It was just a nasty moment. And fortunately, these Cromwellian dissenters were armed to the teeth and trained. And someday somebody's going to write a book about them, because if you look at the English Civil War, what you'll find is that most of the Cromwellian soldiers were passionately religious, and the campfire arguments were probably on theological fine points. So it's a weird moment in all of our history. The founder of Quakerism, a guy named James Fox, visited the Pennsylvania Quakers in 1671, and he was pleased but a little appalled by their treatment of the Native Americans. And he heard that there were other dissenters living amongst the Native Americans in the Sounds. And in 1672, he visited Virginia and went down into the Albemarle to meet those folks. And in his journal, he said they were a godly folk. And it had one interesting interaction with one of the Native Americans, where he asked this Native American gentleman through a translator whether he felt bad when he did something wrong, which and Native American said, of course, it doesn't everyone. And that told Fox that they had that spark of God inside them. And so they were legitimate candidates for conversion. By the time he left the Albemarle, a lot of the folks there that were dissenters and basically religious I don't know, entrepreneurs, I guess, considered themselves to be Quakers. They adopted that view. Now, there's some interesting differences we'll talk about later on. But after leaving the Albemarle, Fox returned to England, and I think what he was doing, what he discovered in Pennsylvania and in the Albemarle, was that the dissenters were creating their own religions. And he was fearful of schisms. And I believe that's one of the reasons he immediately created the London meeting as soon as he got back to England to become an arbiter of Quaker values and tenets. In that regard, he was unable to sway the Albemarle Quakers. They remain different. North Carolina has 3 Quaker meetings, annual meetings. And there are 2 Pennsylvania Quaker annual meetings, and then there's the Albemarle Quakers. So they managed to maintain their difference through the ages. We got the Proprietors. In 1663, a grateful king, Charles II, gave Carolina to these 6 proprietors or 8 proprietors. And that it was theirs to do with as they would, but the idea was that they would get rich selling the land, and he would get rich by their selling the land. And they obviously was just a scheme to get a little bit more money in the royal coffers and enrich the lords who were, and Berkeley was one of them, by the way, who were proprietors. This greed was disastrous. The dissenters in the Albemarle survived peacefully for 50 years because they made an agreement with the local natives that they would be open to the natives and that they would not cross the Chowan River and settle anything on the west side of the Chowan River. And they kept that promise for 50 years. But then the Anglicans got involved and greed took over. This is a close-up of that section of the map that I talked about earlier. You can see what a dense pack of roadbeds there are in the Albemarle on a 1733 map. There's only 2 other roads. One's going south down to Charleston to connect the northern end and the southern end of Carolina, and one is up here, curiously coming down out of Virginia into the Piedmont. We're going to talk about that a lot later on, because that road was built in 1702 and 1704. It was a wagon road. So in 63, the proprietors hired a crew of thinkers to write a constitution for their new property. And it said that John Locke participated in the writing of this constitution. And it gave religious freedom to everybody living under the proprietors. That was remarkable. They made provision for self-government in the absence of government. That is, how do you do the things that people normally ask government to authorize? So they were a provision for taking land included getting your neighbors to agree on where the corners were. And once a year, you would go out and peregrinate your land with your neighbors and make sure the corner markers were still where everybody thought they should be. They made provision for marriage and divorce. And if you told 7 of your neighbors you were married, you were married. And if you told 7 of your neighbors you were no longer married, you were no longer married. I mean, a rather inexpensive and probably painless process, except for the emotional stress of losing a relationship. It provided, most importantly, that nobody could be taken out of Carolina. That is, if you could reach Carolina, you couldn't be taken into court for 5 years. So they intentionally designed a constitution that would attract the destitute and the desperate. And you had escaped indentures and escaped slaves and ne'er-do-wells and debtors that tried to get to Carolina because they would be safe from prosecution. So this is the way they did it. They made a treaty and they kept it. They married in amongst the Native Americans. One of the reasons that these Albemarle folk have been denied their place in history is the idiotic one-drop rule that governed legitimacy in the South for until recently. That is, if you had 1 drop of blood in you that was not Northern European Anglo-Saxon, you were a lesser human being. And because they were not indiscriminate, but open to marriage and breeding with their Native American neighbors, and then Africans as well, they were treated disparagingly. I've got a list of, I think, 13 different words for the folks that live this way in the South. And we know them mainly as Melangeans, but they were called issues, they were called brass ankles. Like I said, there's a bunch of names to explain these Creoles that we had amongst us that couldn't be legitimized for fear of undermining white Anglican rule. The second way that they survived, they had a mutually supportive relationship with the pirates and the privateers who sheltered in the Sounds. And this gave them a naval defense as well as access to European goods and specie. That is, it was money was hard to come by in the colonies. And frankly, one of the things that the privateers and pirates had that everybody wanted was a piece of egg. And then that made the Sounds people, put them in a very, very good position vis-a-vis the rest of the colonies. Every time that the proprietors sent a governor to rule over them, they would throw them out. And from 1663 on, they would chuck them out and put a Quaker in his place, or a Quaker friendly person in his place. And the proprietors even went to the extent of sending a Quaker governor over to the Albemarle, and it'll come to me in a second. This governor left after 2 years of failing to get the local Albemarle people to cross the Chowan. So they were dead set on keeping their promises to the natives. I call this the Irish solution. It was perfected in Ireland by Cromwell. And the way you subdue a majority population with a minority rule is you do it with religion. You put parishes everywhere where there were no Anglicans. And once you had a parish, you had a body of people that could collect tithes to pay for the parish. And so placemen who were underemployed all over England rushed to fill those vestries. And in the long and the short of it, they co-opted local legal systems by religious test laws and created minority government. Well, they did that in Carolina as well, and in Virginia. So that's the method, is you simply make religion dominant. And if you want to know why it is in America, we have a specific provision in our Constitution for no religious tests. That's what it was. It was terribly abused. The Quakers lost their control of the Albemarle. Excuse me, this John Archdale was the Quaker governor sent over. And the way they lost it was the Anglicans began flooding in to fill the local parishes. And that took about 5 years. And around 1700 and 1705, they had enough enough numbers to challenge the Quakers. And they did. And we had a period of roughly 10 years, from 1705 to 1715, where there was a struggle for who was going to control the governorship. And it culminated with a two-faced governor. Carey had been the Proprietors governor and got run off, and then threw himself over to the Quakers, and the Quakers supported him. He became governor again, and that was Carey's rebellion. And Anglican forces came into the Sounds and subdued them, and basically imposed a rule of law. That was bad luck for the Quakers, but it was good fortune. At this time, 1702 to 1715, you had Queen Anne's War, and which brought military and naval power to the dissenters' enemies, pardon that typo. And at the same time, it produced an escape route into the back country called Thickmans Trace. When the war broke out, the militiamen in South and North Carolina and Virginia decided to go down and attack the French and the Spanish in Mobile Bay in Florida, because the allies of the Spanish and the French were raiding the villages and towns in South Carolina especially. And between 1702 and 1704, a guy named Thickman made a wagon road that went from the Chesapeake to the Gulf of Mexico, and it was a remarkable feat, but it was not as remarkable as one might think, because he didn't pioneer a road; he pioneered a route, and he used Native American trails to underpin his roadway. And I've mapped that road from Petersburg all the way to Georgia, and you can still see vestiges of it in all of the states, from Virginia through Carolinas into Georgia. You can see bits and pieces of the original Thickmans Trace. This Piedmont clay really holds a memory. Okay, the results of the Anglican takeover was the Tuscarora War. That's what happens when you get law and order. The next thing you get is a war. And the way it happened was that the Anglicans directed the Proprietors Surveyor General, John Lawson, to sell a block of land to a European lord, von Grafenried from Bern, Switzerland, and now we have Bern, North Carolina. But he needed land for settlers that he was going to bring in. And in 1711, Lawson took him out up the Neuse River with just one slave rowing their boat, and they got arrested by the Tuscarora, and they were tried for land theft. Von Gravenried was dressed so finely that the Native Americans decided he was probably a governor of some kind, and they did not try him for anything. But they tied John Lawson up, tried him, found him guilty of land theft, and we're going to execute him until an old gentleman apparently got up and said, no, he's too young. He didn't realize what he was doing. Let's give him a second chance. He probably learned his lesson. And when they cut his bonds loose, he got up and went into a finger wagging tirade to asking these people, how dare you do this to an Englishman? So they tied him up again and executed him. And that was the beginning of the Tuscarora War, which lasted for 4 years. It wiped out almost all of the indigenous people east of the fall zone and opened up all that land for settlement. The payment to the mercenaries and to their native levies was all the slaves they could capture. That's why it took 4 years. Every time they got enough slaves to go to market, they'd leave, and the war would go on hiatus. So back to getting the Quakers away from the Anglicans. When a road is built, it gets used unless somebody blocks it, and there's no indication that Thickmans Trace was ever blocked. I know what a roadblock looks like on a wagon road, and I've never seen one on Thickmans Trace. It was open to use from 1704 on, which means the backcountry got settled a lot earlier than anyone heretofore has imagined. The people in the Albemarle, getting away from their Anglican neighbors who were abusing them, as usual, moved into the backcountry, and according to native lore, the indigenous peoples' oral histories, they sheltered the remnant Native Americans from slavers who came through periodically to take them into slavery, and the Quakers became their defenders. So that's how they got out of here. That's why they got out of here. And I'm open for questions if anybody's got any. No questions? All right, well, I'll go to bed.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom. That was really interesting. And yes, absolutely. We are ready for questions. Ooh, my light's gone a bit wonky, hasn't it? So the best way that this can work is if you would be so kind as to type your questions into the chat box. I will be able to see them if you type them into the chat box, and I can read them out for Tom. I did have a question. I had a question about Thickmans Trace. Now, I know that a lot of the paths in this area were then turned into larger wagonways, roadways, and eventually highways that we still use. Is there still any evidence of Thickmans Trace, and is it still being used?
It is being used. There are parts of Highway 85 on top of it. It is never more than, the furthest it ever gets away from Highway 85 is about 20 miles when it goes past the Uwharrie Mountains. And Thickman took his trace south of those mountains. Later on, the roads would move north. Highway 85 moved north of those mountains. They're virtually impassable for wheel traffic. And if you take a map of North Carolina and hang it on the wall and step back a few feet, you'll see 2 or 3 places where there's no roads. And one of them is the Uwharrie Mountains, or not the Uwharries, but the oh gosh, Randolph County. It'll come to me. But at any rate, there's a set of mountains east of Renneman that are impassable. And you can still see traces of the pack horse roads that predated the wagon road. The reason that Thickman had to go south of those mountains was that the pack horses could make it through, but barely, and because of the steepness of the slopes. And I've actually mapped a road that sits on top of Pack Horse Road, and you can see where the Pack Horse Road originally went because the paved road could go that way, and they turned off and dropped off the ridge to the left. And if you get out of your car at that 90-degree turn and walk into the bushes, you step into a Pack Horse Road, and it leads you right out to the tip of a hogback with a tremendous erosion problem on one side where the horses used to rump slide down the hill.
Oh.
And on the front of that hill was a switchback trail for porters, Native American moccasin porters that switches back and forth along that hogback. And I guarantee you, when you see one of them, the hair stands up on your arms. It's an amazing experience.
And a little bit more about Thickmans Trace. Was it also used by any, was it used by slavers? And also, is some of it where Airmount is now located?
Yeah, there's a piece, well, there are channels. I insist that people realize that in pre-modern times, there was no Highway 85. The roads went from ford to ford, not from town to town. They went from ford to ford, and a day's travel apart, towns would grow up, and on all of the channels, so that the trading path in Orange County has three distinct variations. There's one that comes down Highway 57, which is a perfect example because it was the wagon road, and in fair weather or foul, it was passable. And today it's roughly 250, 300 feet north of Highway 57, and Pathway School was built on top of it. And when I went to the school district and told them that they were building the school on top of this whole road, they named the school Pathways and then bulldozed it. But just 200 yards or so northeast of Pathway School is an old Quaker cemetery, a big old Quaker cemetery surrounded by stone walls. And you can see the foundations from where the meeting house was. This was the Eno meeting. It was created by Cane Creek. And all of the property between that highway and what is now Hillsborough was owned by Quakers. During the War of the Regulation, 350 Quaker families picked up and left North Carolina and went down to Georgia. And all of them came from Orange County.
350?
Families, yeah, which means like 4 to 5 people per family. That was a bunch of folks that just gave their property to their Anglican neighbors and left.
We actually have quite a few questions about the Quakers. One, and I'm so sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. I'll do my best. Were the Melangeans spin-offs of the Quakers?
The Melangeans?
Melangeans,
No,
yes.
no, the Melangeans are to this day triracial folk who refuse to be otherwise. And they have been fighting with the U.S. Census Bureau for decades to not have to declare themselves red, white, or black. And they can pick as many races as they want. And that's an agreement they have with the Census Bureau. And bless their hearts. The sooner the U.S. government and the school systems and the state governments quit using race as a category, the better we'll all be. It's a specious category, and the Melangeans prove that by their vitality. They're a lively community in Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. You can find them all through the Appalachians, and in North Carolina you find them also on the coast. Albemarle folk.
And speaking of some of these larger groupings and settlements of individuals, where would we find the largest Quaker settlement at this time? Was it in fact in the Carolinas?
Probably Orange County.
Really?
Yeah, and it was a dense pack. When Governor Dobbs arrived in 1752, he imposed the Irish solution immediately. He created 33 Anglican parishes where there were no Anglicans. They were all located in Quaker concentrations for the most part. And Orange County got 3 of the 33. And that brought these Anglican placemen in to take over local government. And that's precisely why we had War of the Regulations, that the Anglicans took over the courts, became abusive. The people said, no, you can't do that. And the governor said, oh, yes, I can. And came up and shot them into order, which is the Anglican way. Somebody disagrees with you, you shoot them. And we have that value deeply embedded in us, apparently. But the Quakers didn't have that value. If somebody disagreed with you, bless his heart, he's wrong, but we love him anyway, you know.
In terms of this conflict that arose because of the sudden crackdown and takeover of the Anglicans, was any of that conflict, and I think you sort of alluded to it, was any of it a spark, a prelude to when we see the Loyalists and the Patriots start to take different paths and have different ideals?
There's an argument made that the War of the Regulation was the first battle of the Revolution. And generally speaking, historians disagree with that for several good reasons. Most of all, because the regulators turned out to be loyalists during the Revolution. They were not revolutionaries. And the revolutionaries were the people that were putting down the regulators. Our founding fathers were the Anglican SOBs that were actually abusing these people enough to go to war. But it's a difficult question. I'm a military historian, and the politics of it boggle my mind. I can't answer the question easily, but there's a vestige. There's something there. The friction between in my next presentation, when I talk about the effect of the Quakers in the Piedmont and in Carolina, I'm almost willing to assert that the reason we consider ourselves a vale of humility between two mountains of conceit was because of the Quaker effect. That is, we still have most of our Native American peoples, most of our Native American tribal organizations, nations, have representatives in North Carolina yet. If you included triracials as Native Americans in the census, North Carolina would have the highest concentration of Native Americans east of the Mississippi. And that's because of the Quakers.
So what I'm hearing is that, yes, there may have been a huge influx of this Anglican ideals and the friction, but because the original ideals, the original settlements were so strongly Quaker, North Carolina and probably South Carolina then has this really unique sort of social history that's trickled down and changed our current ideals because of that Quaker influence.
Is changing, I would say. I don't think it's changed much. The Anglicans dominated the historical narrative in both Carolinas and until the 1990s. And Title IX opened up graduate schools to women and people of color. And those folks are now publishing their works. And it's a remarkable sea change in the history. The narrative is being taken over by non-Anglicans for the first time in history. So it's a very exciting moment for Carolina history as the scales are being peeled, even as we speak. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing these presentations, was that one last desperate gasp by the controllers of the Carolina Narrative was published in 2017, where they asserted that there was no such thing as a North Carolina founder's story. There was no foundation story for this colony, and I beg to differ. And I just gave it tonight.
Well, it's going to be exciting to see. I mean, you're right. You are, I think, kind of on the cutting edge of some of this. And it's really exciting to learn that more people will be joining these ideals and exploring them and deepening the understanding of them.
Yeah, I wish I could hang around and see it. It's a wonderful moment of transformation.
Well, unless we have, if we have any last questions. So I would like to let everybody know, I mean, thank you so much for tonight, Tom. And this is only part 2 of a 4-part series. And we do have part 3 scheduled, which we're really looking forward to. And part 3, you can sign up for on our website, which is very exciting. So we hope to see all of you there. I'm excited. I get a little bit of a tidbit of a wider view of history every time you speak, Tom. So thank you again to Tom Magnuson. Thank you to Tanya Brahmi for the introduction. And thank you to all of you for attending tonight. Like I said before, this is being recorded and it will be made available to you by the end of this weekend.
If I may, I would like to suggest that if it was fun, put something in the tip jar.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this or you've come to any of our other events, if you'd like to see more events from Tom and everybody else, please consider supporting us. If you go to the front page of our website, you will find a button. It says donate now. We would really, really like that. It allows us to be able to reach out to presenters, to spend time putting together these presentations and to present them for free. For all of y'all, which is really important to us. We want this to be made available to everybody for free. We also have some other fundraising efforts that are coming up soon. The very first one is next Thursday. Antonia's here in downtown Hillsborough will be providing 10% of their proceeds for that day to us. So we're very thankful to Antonia's. So plan on Italian next Thursday for dinner. And 10% of their profits will go straight to us. Again, we are a nonprofit and we heavily rely on y'all's support. We have some other upcoming events, not just Tom's 3rd and 4th, but we also have an event that connects to our brand new exhibit that we've just opened. It is called Date Night, Orange County Fashion, Food, Music, and Fun. And it's exactly what it sounds like. We have done an amazing job of crowdsourcing from the community. What was it like to date in Orange County in the 20th century? The entirety of the 20th century. We're talking 1900 to 1999, and we've had some incredible pieces come in from the community. You can book a free time to come visit us through our website, and the website is in the chat box. It is www.orangehistorync.org.
My contribution to the date night was insistence that a backseat be put on display in the museum.
And we do have a back seat because you're right. And we have the tagline downstairs. Many date nights start in the front seat and they end up in the back seat. So perhaps you can bring your date to have a romantic date night down in Hillsborough. We have some wonderful shops, some fantastic restaurants, and you can come visit the museum for free Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Just make sure you book a ticket through our website. So again, thank you to everybody and have a fantastic evening. We'll see you next time.